ESG for Business Resilience, a Revolutionary Approach. Today's business realm is marked by technological disruptions, climate considerations, evolving consumer and societal expectations, and intense global competition. Embracing environmental, social, and governance principles, the ESGs, empowers businesses to adeptly handle these intricacies. This session will discuss the incorporation of ESG practices, highlighting their ability to pinpoint risks, strategize risk management, and fortify businesses with resilience. Our panelists for this session are Mr. Marcelo Bejar, the Vice President, Sustainability and Group Affairs, Natura and Company, Brazil. Mr. Kamran Khan, Managing Director and Head of ESG for Asia Pacific from the Deutsche Bank Group, Singapore. Ms. Linda Kromjong, President Amfori, Belgium. Mr. Abdul Rahman Al Fagial, the CEO of SABIC, Saudi Arabia. Ms. Jennifer Westacott, AO, the Chief Executive, the Business Council of Australia, and Chancellor, Western Sydney University. And we'll have our speakers shortly on the dais. Mr. Marcelo Bejar, Mr. Kamran Khan, Ms. Linda Kromjong, Mr. Abdul Rahman Al Fagial, Ms. Jennifer Westacott to please come up on stage. To steer the discussion, may I invite Mr. Sanjeev Puri, Chairman and Managing Director, ITC Limited, India.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here, and a big thank you for all the eminent panelists who were here from across the globe. It's a very interesting subject that we are here to discuss today, ESG for business resilience and revolutionary approach. Just to set the context, let me call out some events this year. And I'm referring to extreme weather events, which we have been seeing are multiplying with passage of time. Every year, it only gets more frequent, more intense, and greater amount of devastation. So let me narrate what happened this year. And this is not, I promise you, this is not a long list, it's only a short list. In January, Afghanistan saw temperatures plunge to minus 28 degrees, much below what has been the case in the past. Same time, Europe saw its second warmest winter to date. In March and February, Cyclone Freddy caused devastation in parts of Africa. 400 lost their lives, 80,000 got displaced. In the same period, Uruguay had its worst water crisis in its history. April saw heat waves in Europe in Mediterranean, 45 degrees, 38 degrees. And in the same month, Cyclone Mocha created devastation in Pakistan and Myanmar. May saw Canada experience its worst ever wildfires, which ran for 2 months, impacting 25 million acres. July witnessed 4 of the hottest days in the world recorded globally. Europe, China, parts of US experienced extreme heat waves. Not to forget what happened in Hawaii. And in contrast, South Asia, where India and Pakistan were impacted, experienced devastation on account of floods. So these are just a few data points. The list can go on and on. But let me stop here. This is just to say the manner in which extreme weather events are facing us. India itself, in the first 120 days this year, has experienced extreme weather events on 84 days. And what is this doing? Extreme weather events are only going to multiply. IPCC says that 1.5 degree will be crossed in the near term, multiplying extreme weather events. And we have seen the manner in which things have changed between 1.1 and 1.2. So extreme weather events are here to stay. Decarbonization is gaining currency. There's a lot of stuff happening in that space, but the benefits of that will be available decades later. So we have to learn to survive and do well in a hot new world. And what are the implications? The implications are economic losses on public infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, disruption of supply chains, and also loss to personal property. It is also an impact, on the quality of life. It is putting stress on nature. Agriculture, food and nutrition security is becoming a serious issue. Water is becoming a serious issue. And many places in the world are expected to be impacted by water stress over time. Displacement of population, coastlines are becoming riskier and riskier to live with. So that the situation really is very grim. It's an emergency. And I believe that, dealing with adaptation and resilience building is perhaps more urgent than anything else today, because we have to learn to live in this world. And it is in this context that we are here to discuss and debate on how ESG as a framework for responsible conduct of business, how this framework can help accelerate and help help the society move forward as far as building resilience is concerned. To set the, to start off with, I have a question for Marcelo. He's the Vice President, Sustainability and Group Affairs, Natura & Co. Brazil. Natura, I know, has been doing a lot of work on nature-based solutions. But let me ask you, at a more broader level, you know, as far as ESG reporting is concerned, there's been a lot of focus, of course, on decarbonization. And adaptation is very important for Global South, where a large chunk of humanity lives, where a lot of the livelihoods are indexed to nature, indexed to agriculture. So how do you see ESG reporting and disclosures playing a role in advancing this agenda of adaptation and resilience building? Over to you.
Thank you so much for the question, Mr. Sanjeev, and it's my pleasure and honor to be in India for the first time. I've been amazed by everything that was built here and by the perspectives of India, and I think there are many connections between Brazil and India to be built on this and on many other fronts. So to address the issue, and on the ESG metrics and adaptation, we've been working on that space for the last at least 20 years. So actually, Brazil held the first Earth Conference back in '92, when the COP of biodiversity and the COP of climate change were only one. It was called the Earth Conference. And since then, Natura has been putting in place a model that operates with the Amazon region, and nowadays, by its business model, it's protecting over 2 million hectares of the Amazon. And I think when we look at the many ESG standards, and we are talking about 100 standards at least today, considering environmental, social, and also governance aspects, I think there is one thing that must be clarified, and one thing is more urgent and more important than many others, which is nature loss. And we are deforesting very fast. Nowadays, in the world, 96% of mammals are humans and its livestock. So we have to halt and to reverse the laws of nature. So our suggestion is we should give the same discipline that we already created for carbon emissions to nature. So we already agree on science. So IPCC and the scientists of the whole world, they got together. We understand where emissions are coming from. We know where the main offenders are. Now we have to do the same for nature. Likewise, we have public policy in place since the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, the National Disclosure on Carbon. We know how much each one of our countries emit. We should place what are called the NBSAPs, the metrics for nature, as serious plans for each and every one of our countries. So this is something that probably Brazil will, in the next round for G20 or for B20, stress really well on how it should be important for everyone to have their public policy plans on nature. And companies do play a role as well. We have to shift business in order to be not only carbon positive, but also nature positive. And to have our metrics standing for nature as well, connecting the livelihoods and nature in a way. And finally, there is the need to connect finance to everything we do. We already have risk assessments and climate being connected by the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, and we are about to launch, it's a global effort, in September in New York in Climate Week, the TNFD framework. So those frameworks, I think we should align and we should connect the Global South needs with the Northern perspective, because this is really a global issue that can only be tackled together.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcelo. Let me now turn to you, Kamran, Managing Director and Head of ESG for Asia Pacific, Deutsche Bank, Singapore. So you have a global perspective on how developing economies and developed economies are dealing with the issues of sustainability, both adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation, of course, as you know, is receiving less attention, even if you look at the limited amount of flows for climate finance, the proportion that has gone into adaptation has been minuscule, while it's well known that every dollar spent on adaptation can actually save $6 to $8. Given this background, could you share with us on how this is being addressed by policymakers as well as businesses in developing and developed economies? What are the differences?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Mitigation and adaptation, I think it's, if we start at the structural level, what we see is that the mitigation problems or the lack of mitigation is, the front end of that is through the corporates. So between the private and the public sector. So it's the industry in its attempt to expand and grow, it creates emissions. So fundamentally, mitigation is a subject for the private sector, whereas governments do have a role there. Obviously, they can regulate, they can provide the right policies to incentivize private sector to adopt more mitigant strategies. But the fundamental driver for mitigation has to remain with the private sector and as a responsibility. Now, when we come to adaptation, adaptation is essentially what people have to do given that the environment has been deteriorated. So when you have floods coming, when you have tsunamis, when you have all these different natural disasters happening, governments really have no choice but to be on the front end of that to solve for it. So between the public sector and the private sector, we see a very, very clear delineation. Now, when you come to developing countries and deal with the same issues, you can, I think everybody in this audience will understand, if you're a government in a developing country, you have limited resources, you are absolutely every time going to go and help the vulnerable first, which is, again, more so on adaptation, and not just adaptation across the board, but adaptation for people who cannot defend themselves from the natural disasters. So I think going forward for emerging economies, and here I will end with a little bit of a question mark, because when you are talking about a developing country, governments have limited resources. They are being channeled towards adaptation. The question then becomes, what is the private sector doing in emerging economies? Are they going to be hamstrung because they have to now adopt world-class mitigation strategies? And that is a two-way street, meaning for an emerging economy, for example, like India, there's a huge opportunity. There's a new market developing. India can be a leader in this space, both in terms of exports and building expertise within the country. But at the same time, the developed economies have to keep those markets open for Indian services and products. And that's true for Brazil, and would be true for South Africa and other countries. So I think this is what this B20 discussions are about, and I'm sure that the COP28 discussions will go into that. And I see that the dialogue on environment, adaptation, mitigation is going to slowly transition also towards the WTO discussions on trade and commerce, because this will become a political economy issue very, very quickly if it hasn't already become that.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Linda Krompjong, President Amphori, Belgium. Marcelo spoke about the role of ESG in reporting. You've been an advocate on basing this on systemic due diligence. So could you share your perspectives on how due diligence can play a role in furthering this objective?
Yes, thank you. I'm not saying can't play a role, I think must play a role. You, in your introduction, already said the many disruptions that we have, so without strong and solid and robust supply chains, we all will have issues, and we really need to make sure that the supply chains are becoming more sustainable than they currently are. with less impact on the environment, and with better workers' rights. And coming back to yesterday evening, I'm pretty sure many of you also joined that beautiful dinner, this beautiful location. I was really pleased to see that sustainability was also integrated in, say, the presentation that we have seen from the garment industry with all the beautiful dresses that were shown. Companies rely on complex supply chains, and that's the reality. And a company is as sustainable as the supply chain is sustainable. So if we want to have sustainable companies, we will need to have sustainable supply chain. And we can only do that if we make sure that we adapt, which is a word that you also used, but also become more resilient in that. And how do we become more resilient? Then we need to have a good understanding about what the supply chain is about, where the issues are, where the products and services come from in this complex world, but also what the conditions are in which they are being produced and being delivered. If we look into, say, the transparency finance nexus, which is really, say, at the core of ESG reporting, that's great that we have that. It's great that we have reporting frameworks. Yes, we would like to see less, but we really need to make sure that ESG reporting is underpinned by robust due diligence. The reporting is not an end in itself, it's a means to something. And we can only achieve that if we focus on robust due diligence on all elements of ESG, because they're all equally important, whether it's environment, whether that's social, labor, human rights, but also strong and robust governance systems. ESG due diligence means that a company understands where the risks are and acts accordingly. It's as simple as that. Put mitigation actions in place to resolve the issues and do that in a collaborative manner with their suppliers to build long-term relationships. Because it was really proven also during the COVID-19 pandemic that afterwards those companies that had strong due diligence in place, had strong relations and insights in the supply chain, came out better out of this crisis. So I don't need to convince anyone, I think, here that this makes good business sense, and there's many business cases and examples out there. If we look into the due diligence angle, I spoke about understanding your risk, mitigating those, but it also means that you will need to make sure that if there issues occur, if you can't find them yourselves, there's very often other people who find them for you. And that's where we need to have also good grievance mechanisms in place within the supply chain to help people find the ways to identify issue, report them so that they can be addressed and mitigated. And that is also, I would say, a collaborative approach to grievance handling where supply chains and the workers in the supply chains would benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I'll now turn to Abdul Rahman, Chief Executive, SEBIC, Saudi Arabia. I know SEBIC is at the forefront of sustainability, but maybe I'll ask you to give us a little perspective on how sustainability is being progressed in Saudi Arabia, and particularly, throw some light on how the issues of adaptations are being looked at.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Appreciated. And just before I start, if you allow me, I just would like to thank Mr. Chandra for the great, organization and arrangements of the B20. Thank you very much, Mr. Chandra, and also to put the ESG as the last panel, which is the best, I guess. So. Sustainability in Saudi Arabia has been addressed long time back, actually, and it is part of the ESG. And if I would say the ESG, if we take, the whole part of ESG is very important. It's not only the environment. The governance has been there for more than 100 years. The social are also being adopted and incorporated among all the corporations. So the only one that is evolving and recent being adopted is in the environment. And there is, and unfortunately in the environmental part, which is, major part of the sustainability, it is differ from a country to country, it is differ from a region to region. However, in Saudi Arabia, this has been taken very serious. And actually in the the presidency of Saudi Arabia for the G20 in the year of 2020 has been initiated the circular carbon economy, which is very important and the very part of the sustainability. And it's not only addressing the environmental part, it is addressing also the economical part. And this is very important. The moment that we adopted the sustainability is part of our values, part of our business models, and part of our economical and business cases that we built. So the moment that the sustainability is addressed as a business cases, that it has to be adopted by everyone, the moment that everybody is going to jump in. It's not something to be regulated and to be enforced in a way that it can be adopted and it's required, a lot of efforts. It should be part of the business models. And this is what Saudi Arabia is alluding to. In addition to this, I think that was a great initiative also that has been set up in Saudi Arabia, which what you call it the SGI, which is the Saudi Green Initiatives. And that Saudi Green Initiatives is part of the Middle East Green Initiatives, while Saudi Arabia has announced that will implement and implant 50 billion trees. And that 50 billion trees is an equivalent to reduce 278 million tons of CO2 emission. And I think with adaptation of this is really addressed, the sustainability for long and longer term. In another way, in the setting up the ESG and the sustainability in totality guidelines, reporting and disclosure, Saudi Arabia is the first country in GCC that adopting and announcing the guidelines for the disclosure and for the reporting of the ESG for listing companies and non-listing companies. And that's really helping, to stimulating the thinking of the people and the corporation to make sure that the sustainability is part of their business. As I said, in the carbon and the circular carbon economy, which is an important part, okay, in Saudi Arabia also, to address the sustainability, it's not only setting up the KPIs for the sustainability, but address this as a diversified economy. The diversification in the economy it not depends only on the oil and gas as a resource for the economy and revenue for the country, but diversify this. This will help protect the environment and stimulate the innovation and also raising the standards of living.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Jennifer, Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia and Chancellor of Western Sydney University, Australia. Now, you have a larger perspective on how businesses are integrating ESG into their business models. And so could you share your perspectives from Australia and also in particular throw some light on how this is being leveraged to build resilience?
Well, thanks very much. Look, I think Australian companies, like many around the world, are now on this unstoppable trajectory, driven by capital flows, community expectations, government regulation, and of course, shareholder investor expectations. I think what we see in the leading companies in Australia is that they are seeing this as value creation, not compliance. They're seeing this as building resilience, not simply a license to operate, and they're seeing this as a point of comparative advantage. So 70% of Australian companies have signed up to the gold standard of climate reporting. So I just take us through the three areas and what's happening in Australia. If I go to environment, I think it's important that we not forget the broader environmental challenge. We talk a lot about decarbonisation over the last couple of days, but the simple reality is there are many parts of our world that have been massively degraded environmentally. So in Australia, we're seeing a regulatory and a policy commitment to move to that nature positive stance, not just maintenance, but nature positive. That means there's a huge opportunity in the offset market to create those win-win solutions by making sure that we use those carbon offsets to drive environmental improvements. More and more companies are looking at adaptation and resilience. As many people know, Australia's gone through some extremely significant environmental problems, major fires, major flooding. We're also seeing in the environmental space more and more emphasis on reporting for transparency, for investment, for transparency, for accountability, and a pretty harsh view being taken by governments over so-called greenwashing. If I go to the social of the ESG, this is a very expanding area. The first point is that Australian companies are getting very serious about looking at indentured and forced labour in their supply chains. We have a very progressive Modern Slavery Act in Australia. Companies are also continuing their leadership on gender equity, women's advancement, LGBTQ issues, world-class safety standards, and of course in our country, First Nations economic advancement, as we have a major constitutional issue before our country this year, recognising the right of our Indigenous Australians to have a voice in how their affairs are managed. But we're starting to see new areas, ethical AI, privacy and data. This is a complex area for Australian companies, the whole social, particularly when they take stances on social issues. We saw that with Disney in the United States, and there is quite a pushback in Australia about companies taking stances on social issues. On governance, transparency is the new norm. Companies are losing shareholder value if they fail to manage problems properly. Increasingly focused on integrating reporting, and something that's interesting in Australia, more and more companies actively looking at things, actively looking at their supply chains, actively looking at whether they have sexual harassment or other things happening in their companies. A couple of big shifts that I think are worth talking about. We will see more and more procurement activities of government starting to drive social outcomes. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, I think a lot of people have forgotten how much social investment is in part of that act. We're starting to see trade agreements having embedded social outcomes, and we're seeing major changes to supply chains. Just a couple of comments on some challenges that I think are worth thinking about today. The asymmetry of effort, whether it's decarbonisation or modern slavery, how do we strike the right balance between driving change and not isolating emerging economies? How do we get better standards for reporting? How do we avoid regulatory overreach, which I know we're going to talk about? And how do we develop the right policy architecture and get comparability across countries? And then, of course, financing, which we talked about yesterday, but we haven't talked here at the B20 about financing the environmental, not just the decarbonisation, so the role of biobanking, the role of biodiversity offsets and so on. But this is a major leadership issue for Australian companies. It's a point of differentiation, and I think if we think about everyone in this room understands the value of compound growth. If all of our individual ESG actions as companies are taken together, that is going to be the biggest force for change for driving that inclusive growth that we talked about yesterday. So a very important initiative for Australian companies, much more about value creation than compliance.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me now turn to you again, Marcelo. We have, just before that, let me say we have just about 15 minutes, so an opportunity for a quick round of questions. I know your company, Naturo, has been at the forefront of nature-based solutions. You're focused on being nature positive. Nature is extremely important for Global South, extremely critical for adaptation. I think just to bring this to life, maybe I request you to share some real examples that your company has pursued.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And this is a crucial one because I've been living for the last 3 years in London, and I see that there is a new debate coming up between physical removal or nature removal. And I think there is a matter for the Global South to unify on a position to create the ways for nature-based solutions to become effective, to really tackle climate change, to avoid double counting, and to make sure that we are going on the right direction. Besides that, there is the obvious equation that there will be no Paris Agreement being matched, the objectives won't be matched if tropical forests are not standing. And tropical forests will not stand if the Paris Agreement is not matched. So one thing correlates to the other, and we are all connected. Just want to give a quick example on how we operate and how we try to build that in a very practical way. So I was last week actually in the Amazon checking how things were established with the communities we operate with. Almost 10,000 people, 41 communities. One of them had a problem of deforestation, and one of the trees called ucuba was being used to produce broomsticks and roofs in the richer part of Brazil. And Natura use a lot of technology and science to understand what could be done with the fruits of its trees, and we understood that we could pay twice the price the community would get for the wood for half of its seeds. So immediately the community stopped chopping and started planting again. And that created a whole new line of products called the Ukuba line, which is, I think, a very good example, not only on how to curb deforestation and how to incentivize nature-based solutions, but also how to understand where the problem is coming from and not try to walk away from the problem just by saying, oh, we won't deal with them because there is deforestation. No, it's about correcting the problem and regenerating where the problem is. I think this will be more and more important as we move forward.
Thank you. Kamran, you run the Deutsche Bank Center of Excellence on ESG, and you have a global footprint. I understand that Deutsche Bank follows the EU taxonomy, ESG taxonomy. There are viewpoints that this taxonomy may not be easy to implement in some parts of the world, but in Deutsche Bank you have done that. So would you throw some perspectives on how you have brought the EU standards into, say, the emerging economies into Asia, and if there were any challenges that you faced and how you kind of mitigated that?
Great. As a bank, we do roughly about 100 billion euros worth of ESG financing a year. It's been on that track record for the last 3 years. We do have our own taxonomy. It's very closely tied to the EU taxonomy. And more importantly, we have a pretty strong control system put in place to ensure that that standard is applied across the world, regardless of where the transaction is being done. Then comes the tricky part, which is we also recognize that trying to do ESG in a credible way in emerging economies is not easy. It requires a special set of skills and institutional frameworks. So that's why we set up the ESG Center of Excellence in Asia. It's in partnership with Monetary Authority of Singapore. And it covers all of Asia. And our mandate is do transactions, ESG transactions in Asia which meet global standards. Now, how do you do that? You do that by taking care of 3 key variables. One, you must know sustainability 2-3 layers deeper than, frankly, where the rest of the financial services industry is today. They are learning it. You really need to know what is material in which sector, and you need to keep track of what the global conventions are so you can advise your clients accordingly. Second, you need to know how those approaches and those types of frameworks apply to the context of emerging economies. So it's, just trying to do a simple copy and paste into emerging economies doesn't work. You need solutions, customized solutions, not your, traditional replication of existing transaction structures. So that's why we set up the Center of Excellence. And the last bit that is very, very important is for our clients, both who are headquartered in Europe, North America, and elsewhere, as well as Asia's own MNCs and large corporates who sell overseas under their own brand name. They want to make sure that they meet global standards because this is what trade is mandating. If you want to sell into Europe, your product had better be compliant with European rules, whether you manufacture it in India or you manufacture it in the UK. So if you are that company, you have no choice but to do that. And that's where I think the comments we heard from about Australia, value creation is the driver. How can I put ESG into my commercial strategy and make it better? How can ESG strategy be accretive to my valuation? That's what we do as a bank for our clients. We try to show them how can you do this both to become attractive business partners in your verticals, also how to make sure that your cost of capital remains as low as possible, because that's a key driver of change as well. If you are not taking care of your ESG profile, you should expect your cost of capital to continue to rise. And last but not least, this is something that gets forgotten, and that's true for our bank as it is true for all our clients. The ESG strategy, the approaches, they are about value creation, they're about meeting the mandate, but they're also about meeting the aspirations of your own staff. I always say everything we do in the ESG space at Deutsche Bank, at some level, it's a reflection of what our staff want to be. Everyone wants to come to work at a place that's seen as responsible, that's doing the right thing. So I think this is an element. It sounds very soft. It's not the kind of thing that finance people talk about, but it is a very, very important motivation. And I hope that at meetings like this one, people would leave with that understanding that it's also about the emotions of our own people and making them feel good about what they do.
Thank you, Kamran. Let me now turn to Linda. ESG, sustainability, and more so adaptation and resilience are evolving areas both from business practices as also regulation, and much of it, I would dare say, also is uncharted territory. And a lot can be gained through collaboration. So how do you think we can facilitate and build some platforms and leverage the power of collaboration for the greater good?
Yes, thank you. Let me come back to what you said and summarize it. You said ESG is an opportunity if done well. It's a business opportunity that adds to value chain, but it equally gives access to finance, but also make sure your people stay with you or are willing to join you as a company. And I really think that's crucial in how we approach these concepts. It's good business sense. If we look into collaboration, why is collaboration important? Because we are talking about all companies. It doesn't matter if you are a big company, an M&E, it doesn't matter if you're an SME or if you're even a micro enterprise, all will need to fulfill those requirements and expectations for the good of themselves, for good business sense, to be attractive and really make sure that the expectations that are out there are being met and fulfilled, to really give them a sustainable future. And that's not easy. And I think that's where collaboration comes in, because ESG, due diligence, performance, risk assessments, these are not easy concepts. But if we join forces, we can make them easier and help companies understand those those expectations and those concepts, and then really start working on it. So that's what, for example, we do at Amfori. Collaboration is really in our DNA. We have around 2,500 companies who have a multitude of suppliers across the world, and we help them in managing the supply chain responsibly, environmentally and socially. And we do that because we team up on a joint code of conduct where the principles, social principles being included, environmental principles being included. We do that by joint capacity building, which is crucial. We do that by working together on improvement actions. And also alluded that we work together on establishing a grievance mechanism for the suppliers and their workers, because each and every company will need to do that on their own. That is going to be quite complicated. So joining forces, really not reinventing the wheel, embark on what already has been developed and what's working, but also jointly work towards improving that and put in place more practical tools and solutions to help companies advance on the sustainability journey. One element crucial for collaboration, it's amongst companies. that helps, but it's also this collaboration between companies and governments that is needed, where I really, really would like to ask every government to focus on capacity building and really make that instrumental and help every company to embark on that journey, but also the intergovernmental collaboration. I think the B20 is an example of that. It's where we engage with each other, where we listen to each other, where we learn, but also where we are striving for joint solutions that make our life easier, because that's ultimately what we are here for, making business life easier, more accessible, and more harmonized. Thank you.
Thank you. So, SEBIC has been, as I said earlier, at the forefront of sustainability. And Abdul Rahman, it may be very useful for all of us to hear some real examples just to bring it to life, and also throw some perspective on this very interesting point made by earlier on, how this can be a source of value creation aside from merely being seen as a compliance stroke risk mitigation strategy. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Actually, it is a life example, SABIC, since it's been established in 1976 as a sustainable company, because at that time there was the Saudi Aramco was the largest producer of oil, and there is a lot of gas flared with the associated oil. SABIC has mandated to collect all this gas and make sure that there is a value to be created for those hydrocarbons with these. So we've been established as a sustainable company. Sustainability is in part of our DNA since the day one. As you may know, we are operating in more than 50 countries, so we have to meet the evolving environmental regulations and guidelines, and we have to addressing the stakeholders' requirements in all these countries. And also we have to drive our growth in a very sustainable and in a very responsible way. So to do this, we have set up, a lot of initiatives in the company to make sure that we address the sustainability in a way that it is a business inherited. And we started with the energy efficiency. And in the energy efficiency, to make sure that we have the utmost energy intensity in our operations, and try to convert some of our equipments and needs that driven by steam into electricity, and try our utmost to have that source of electricity to be a renewable electricity. This is the first one. And the second one in the carbon capture. And we have developed our own technology to make sure that we capture the carbon dioxide emissions and convert this into valuable material. And we, in 2015, we started the largest CO2 capture plant in Jubail in Saudi Arabia to capture 500,000 metric ton of CO2 emission. And not only capture this, but the beauty of the technology that we developed, it is a capturing plus purification. So we purify that CO2 to the level that it can be used in the food chain, in the beverages. And we utilize the 500,000 metric ton into the production of ammonia and production of methanol, as well as it helps in the process of the desalination of the water. So up to this, and we will continue to do so, and we'll continue to capture that CO2, and we have a program that will capture by 2030 at least an additional 2 million ton of CO2 emission in Saudi Arabia. The second thing is that we try to maximize the renewable resources for the electrification of our plants. And I will give a live example, as per your request, Mr. Sanjeev, that in Cartagena in Spain, we have a world-class plant of polycarbonate. And by the middle of 2024, the total consumption of power and electricity in that plant is going to be renewable from the solar energy. About 100 megawatt of electricity is going to be 100% from the solar energy. And a lot of things coming in the way. So this is the way that we address our sustainability. In addition, that also we endeavor into the low carbon ammonia for the energy sectors. and we are the first shipment that has come from SABIC with the collaboration with Saudi Aramco to send at least 3 shipments this year has been sent from the ammonia to be the low carbon ammonia to be used in the energy sector. One of them in June has been sent here to India to use it in the energy source. So we have so many life examples in SABIC, but I know the time does not help to address all of this.
Thank you. You know, this is also an area where regulations are evolving. This is also an area where there are plethora of frameworks and rating systems available. And it is also a very, very dynamic area which will require regulation to be dynamically modified. And this naturally impacts businesses. And there could be potentially this whole issue of for businesses to align, and there could be some tension between business strategy and regulations. So how do you see this space, and what would be your advice to corporates on how to best look at this whole facet?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest risks in this area is poorly designed or overreaching regulation. So it's one thing for governments to set outcomes. It's another thing to tell companies how to meet and achieve ESG standards. That will kill innovation, that will kill the dynamism that you've talked about, because this is a changing and dynamic area and not everyone is in the same starting point. So I think the first thing is that we need, particularly through the G20, to start thinking about some standards for reporting, some standards or some comparability and some best practice in things like environmental permitting, which is basically holding a lot of things back, and making sure that we keep the focus on the conversation that was had yesterday, the and not the or, when governments try to absolutely narrow the range of activities that the private sector is doing, that will just stifle economic growth. So there's a lot of areas that I think the G20 and the B20 can push into around those standards, around those best practice for regulation, and around those stable policy settings that are needed to drive incentives, to drive capital flows and so on. I think the final point is that from the corporate sector's point of view, if we do not lead in our ESG strategies, if we do not push hard into this, governments will push hard back. And they will have to push hard back for a couple of reasons. A, money is moving in a different direction. 2, the community wants and expects change. And 3, there are major, major problems with our planet and with our environmental standards and with our the huge problems of climate change. Governments will not sit back and do nothing. They will expect companies to lead. Either we lean into this or governments will lean on us.
Thank you. Thank you all for these very insightful comments. We're unfortunately running out of time. Very clearly, this is an area that requires a lot of attention. I think in the ESG Action Council also, this has been flagged as an area that is not sufficiently covered through the evolving regulation and the ESG frameworks. And it needs to be done given the urgency. The impact is certainly a lot on nature and therefore on Global South. But it also goes into the very design of urban infrastructure in the industrial ecosystems and so on and so forth. And this is an area that's also been receiving a very small percentage of the small capital flows of sustainable finance. But it's certainly an area that requires a lot of attention. This is a dynamic area and will require businesses also to adapt and fine-tune strategies in a dynamic way. We heard many interesting ways to go about it, looking at it as a value creation activity, looking at the power of collaboration and the need to do it. Otherwise, your cost of funds will become more and more expensive. And some great examples on nature and many other insights came in during the discussion. I will not attempt to summarize everything, but certainly conclude by saying that it's been very insightful. And all the panelists have been very active participants in the ESG Action Council. So I thank all of you for your participation today and for your contributions in the work of the councils. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Puri. May I request you to please present small tokens of appreciation to all our speakers first, please? If I could request all our speakers to please move together so that we can take a group photograph. Very quickly, thank you. Thank you very much. May I request you all to please now take your seats down below as we move on to the important session now of handing over to Brazil. We're just making the changes on the day. Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach the 18th G20 summit in New Delhi under India's presidency, it is a privilege to acknowledge the pivotal role of the B20 Engagement Group. Since its establishment in 2010, the B20 has steadily grown into one of G20's most influential platforms championing the global business agenda.